Hello, everybody. This is Nick DeTiro, Professor of Information Technologies and Computer Science. We learned very early on in programming to not repeat code. We don't like redundant code in our programs. For example, if I need to solve for the area of a circle in 4, 5, 6 different places in a program, I don't want to copy that code over and over and over again because what if it needs to be changed slightly? So we learn through different processes. We can potentially create maybe a function to solve for an area, and then we just call that function. So if there's any changes that would be associated, it's in one place. So duplication of code is a really bad thing in programming logic. And as we worked deeper and deeper into the concepts, we started to get into object-oriented programming. And in object-oriented program, we create a class, which is a cookie cutter that we can then create objects that are associated with that class. We're now at a somewhat important aspect of object-oriented programming, and that is the concept of inheritance. What we're going to discover in OOP is, or in anything, that many things are very similar to each other. They might have slight differences. For example, you might have a car versus a boat, or a car and a boat. Both are vehicles, right? Both do something, but there might be a slight difference internally in the programming on how you would program a car versus a boat. But probably many of their traits would be identical. And we could accomplish that in OOP in what's called inheritance. And inheritance allows us to derive or create a class, sometimes called a subclass, sometimes called a child class, from a parent class. So we derive a class from another class. So we can use things from the parent class. Now, in this video, I'm going to refer to as child parent. So we can derive a child class from a parent class. And what that allows us to do, that allows the child to have access to all the stuff, all the methods that are associated with the parent, and yet have their own individual items. So in this video, I'm just going to explain inheritance. We're going to use our GURPS universe. Again, you don't need to know how to play GURPS. It's just this is the universe that we're going to be working on because it kind of makes things very structured. It's going to be broken up into 3 parts. The first part is sometimes it's difficult to do inheritance. It kind of takes, well, that might work as inheritance, and then you struggle and you make it work. And then the second example will be a fairly simple, fairly clean, fairly good example of an inheritance. And then the third example is really kind of a cool one where we can really deep dive into the complexities of inheritance. Let's start with kind of a bad example where it'd be very difficult to implement inheritance. Let's go up to my screen. All right. First of all, these are, now we're kind of like in an advanced book of GURPS. I cannot share them. They're copyrighted. I own them. I purchased them. But it's not about GURPS again. I'm looking at potentially 2 classes. I'm looking at a character class, and now I want to look at an animal class. Now, real quickly, a character class in GURPS just means that that is a player character in which the player can use that character to go and do things. An animal class is what they refer to as a non-player character. The character really doesn't do anything, and we can adjust things accordingly. But if we were to deep dive into a character class, and we've seen this in other videos, and we talked about it in the course, we have, excuse me, we have basic characteristics or basic attributes, and in other videos and in a class lecture, we said we have basic attributes that if we make changes to them, we then would affect secondary attributes, right? And if you want to rewatch that video, just fine. So we have basic attributes, and any make changes to those would affect the secondary characteristics. But if I go to animals and I begin to take a cursory look at animals, and it looks like, wow, animals have the same thing. Animals have these basic attributes of strength, dexterity, IQ, and health. And then they have the secondary attributes of will, perception, speed, dodge, move. And then they have traits and skills. And you say, oh, I can potentially the derive the animal class or create the animal class just by using the character class. Not really. Because if I was to deep dive into this, I would discover that even though they look the same, they have strength, dexterity, IQ, and health, and then the secondary ones, they're not set up the same way. For a character, going back to a character, there is a correspondence. I make a change in one of the if I make a change in one of the basic attributes, that's going to affect the secondary attributes. But in animals, not the case. In animals, there's no correspondence. If I make a change to strength, it's not going to affect anything else. They don't have all the secondary characteristics because animals can't do certain things. So they actually remove a bunch of things from animal and they say, okay, no, we just set those characteristics. And then there's just parameters, rules, like an intelligent animal can't go above an intelligence of 6, right? So it's pretty hard coded. Now I'm going to use a program I call that's called Visio, and Visio allows us to map or structure, do flow charts. So let me bring Visio into the screen. And Visio allows us to map and structure flowcharts and programming. And in this particular one, I mapped out the classes associated in our little GURPS universe. And most of this look familiar from previous videos, but it's kind of like an official. And if I look at character has character first name, character last name, player first name, player last name, all the other stuff that we've talked about. And you notice that down here we have the methods that would be associated with this class, and we have a constructor method, and we have all these getters, setters, and printers. Inside character, we could increment and decrement. We've seen that in other. Let's take a look at what the animal class would look like. It doesn't have all those things. It doesn't have all the attributes. It has the basic attributes, but it has the secondary attributes. And it has a constructor. The methods are very straightforward. There's no way to increment or decrement intelligence or anything because an animal is basically an animal. So the methods are significantly different than the methods we saw in the character class. So this would not be, even though it looks like, this would not be a good example of an inheritance type situation or a way that we can create an animal object from a character class. It doesn't really work too well. So let's take a look at something that may work very well. Let's take a look at vehicles. All right. Again, we're not going to deep dive into GURPS, but generally speaking, how GURPS set this up, and again, the only reason I use GURPS is it kind of confines my universe. I don't have to get hyper complex and things. It defines my universe. And if I begin to look, basically GURPS has four types of vehicles, really 3 types of vehicles. 4 types of vehicles. One is a ground vehicle. That could be a car, that could be a motorcycle, a scooter, a bicycle, you name it. So that's a ground vehicle. And then they have did I skip it? Yeah. They have a watercraft a boat, some kind of vehicle that crosses water. Then the third one is aircraft vehicle, something that flies in the air. The fourth one, not going to talk, is spacecraft. It's just kind of advanced, but fundamentally spacecraft they just treat as a type of vehicle. Now, if I was to deep dive into this, but just to even take a cursory look, I can see like the ground vehicle has all these attributes, tech level, vehicle name, all these different levels. All these different attributes. If I was to look at a watercraft vehicle, it has all the exact same attributes, with the exception they added one. For a watercraft, they have something called a draft, and draft is just how high or how low the boat or that vehicle resides in the water. We don't have a draft value inside the ground vehicles, right? So a boat or a watercraft has everything that the ground vehicle has, plus it has a draft. If I was to look at aircraft, it has all the things associated with the ground vehicle, but it has something called a stall, meaning that if it goes to a certain speed, it stalls and it drops out of the air. So it doesn't have a draft. So we have these three types of vehicles. We have ground, which has all the characteristics of a vehicle. We have watercraft, which has all the characteristics of a vehicle, but it has a draft, another attribute in there called draft. And then we have an aircraft vehicle, in which it has all the characteristics of a standard vehicle, but it has a stall. Now, if I was to just create the three classes from that without using inheritance, there would be all redundancy. There would be so much redundancy. Each one of those classes would have the exact same thing, but some one difference in each of them. In ground vehicle, we don't have draft or stall. In water vehicle, we have draft. In air vehicle, we have stall. 90% of it would be redundant. So this would be a great or a good place that we can do an inheritance. So let's take a look at this. Again, I'm going to go to my Visio, and I'm going to look at vehicle here. And the parent class in vehicle is something just called vehicle. And it has all the standard characteristics. All right. So it has tech level vehicle, vehicle strength and health, handling, stability, all the attributes that are associated with any kind of vehicle in GURPS are inside this parent or base class of vehicle. But now if I scroll down, and it has all the methods here. But now if I scroll down, we have child classes or subclasses. And the first subclass is ground. Now, the interesting thing about ground is ground doesn't have any real differences between a standard vehicle. So ground just says, I don't have any additional attributes. I still have my own constructor. And the only thing I really need to have in ground is a print method to print a ground vehicle. Right? So already I reduce the amount of duplication by saying, okay, I'm going to have my ground vehicle, but it's going to be based upon the standard vehicle throughout GURPS. If I look at watercraft, the only difference between watercraft and a standard vehicle, watercraft has a draft. So watercraft has its own constructor. It has additional methods. One is set draft, one is get draft, and then they print the craft information, watercraft information. Draft. So again, we say we don't have this duplication involved here. And then finally, we have aircraft vehicle. Aircraft vehicle derives all of its attributes from the standard vehicle or the parent class. It gets all those attributes, but then it adds one additional attribute, the stall, and it has its own constructor. It has its own set. It has its own get, and it has its own print. Now, one of the nice things about inheritance is these children have access to the parents' methods. That's important. So we don't have to duplicate all the methods. We would just have to create the methods that would be associated with the child class. Let me repeat that. The children have access to the parent methods, but the children do not have access to the other children's methods, or the parent doesn't have, if I was to create an object with just the parent class, it would not have access to the children. But the important thing is that children have access to the parents' methods. Right? No redundancy. So if I create a ground vehicle and I needed to get its health, I would just access the get health from the parent. So again, quick look here. And this is a really, really nice example. This is a nice, clean example where we have three subclasses that generally have mostly all the same stuff, with the exception each one of those subclasses, each one of those child classes have some slight differences. So I would not want to duplicate the code. Now, let's get into one that can be really sophisticated. But this one's going to really show you how we can truly clean up and get rid of redundancy without inheritance. This was an outstanding example. Let's look at one that can be a little bit more complex and more sophisticated. I'm going to go to what they call GURPS equipment. GURPS equipment or an item is anything that we, as a character, you can carry with you. You can carry a piece of rope. You can carry a toothbrush. You can carry a shield. You can carry armor. You can carry a sword. You can carry a weapon, right? So equipment is anything that the character can carry with them. And through some deep diving, we have, not buying equipment, sorry. We have your basic equipment, and then we get into weapons, and then we get into defensive type items, a helmet, shield, sword, a gun. And even that, a weapon, and again, this is why I use GURPS. You don't have to learn GURPS. This is why I use GURPS. It defines a specific universe. When we talk about weapons, there's generally two types of weapons. There is a melee weapon, a weapon that you basically hold, right? Or there could be a projectile weapon where something is projected out, a gun, a spear, a bow and arrow, and things like that. So we have equipment, and equipment has all these certain characteristics associated with it. We would have subclasses of equipment where we can have just armor and weapon, and then we would have even subclasses of subclasses. Now, let's take a look at this in Visio. This may make more sense inside Visio. We'll start with the equipment. All equipment inside GURPS, inside the world, our little universe here, has a tech level, and the tech level is just when something can start or when you can start using it. So if you have a campaign, real quickly, if you have a campaign that it's the Middle Ages, they can't use an Uzi submachine gun. So that's just a way to control what equipment they can use at certain times. We have the equipment name, we have the cost of the equipment, and then we have how much that equipment weighs. So every piece of equipment inside GURPS has these 4 characteristics associated with them: tech level, equipment, cost, and weight. So no matter what piece of equipment you get, it has to have those. And you'll notice that it has its own methods, has its own constructor method, set method, get method, print method. But now we go down. And so, before we go down, so in this base equipment, we could have something like a piece of rope, right? A piece of a shoe or shoes, toothbrush, you name it, a cup, you name it. That would be a piece of equipment, a backpack, whatever. But then as we drill down a little bit, let's take a look at just this first one here, shield. Since shield is an item, the subclass shield is an item, it has to have all the characteristics of the parent, but the only difference with the shield is it has an attribute called defense bonus, right? So in the subclass of shield, I only have to worry about one attribute. I have to worry about all the other ones, but I only have to have the methods and things associated with the defense bonus. If I was to look at armor, armor is a child of equipment. So if I put on a flak vest or something like that, that's a piece of equipment. So it has all the basic characteristics associated with equipment here, but it has something called damage resistance. So we can see immediately that we have standard equipment, a piece of rope. Then we might have a shield. A shield just gives us some defense bonus. And then armor has something called damage resistance. But let's take a look at weapon. Now, weapon has, again, weapon is a subclass of equipment. Weapon has two additional attributes. It has a damage, how much damage can it do, and that's based upon a damage table. Don't worry about that. And it has the minimum strength required to use that weapon. For example, you can't, if you're using a heavy bow, you have to have a certain strength to pull that bow back. Don't worry about. So, but the important thing is we have the parent class called equipment. And then it has a child class called weapons, and weapons has two characteristics. So all weapons inside GURPS has the characteristics called damage and strength that you can use as weapon. And again, you will notice that it has its own methods. Let me repeat again. A child can use any methods from the parent. So a child could acquire anything from the parent. Child can't look at other children. Parents can't really look at child. But the most important thing is a child acquires all that stuff from the parent. And if I scroll down, you'll notice that weapon has two subclasses of its own. The first subclass is what they call a melee, right? The melee basically doesn't add anything, but I kind of segmented it. I said, okay, melee is just a basic weapon. And again, a melee weapon is something you physically hold. But you'll notice that weapons can also be classified in what they call a range weapon. And a range weapon means that something's going to leave the weapon, some kind of projectile is going to leave the weapon. It could be a bow and arrow, it could be a spear, it could be a bullet leaving a gun. And you will notice that it has its own attributes. So a range weapon will have accuracy, range of fire, shots, reload, things like that. So if we work our way from the child up to the parent, a range weapon is going to have accuracy, range, rate of fire, shots, and all its methods. But a range method will also have damage and strength associated with it, with all its methods. And then a range weapon will have equipment as part of equipment, so it will have all its attributes and methods associated with it. So you can see in this example, it's a nice, clean example that I don't have to repeat classes. If I did not have inheritance, each one of these things would be its own class with its own repetition. Or redundancy, and we don't want that. We don't want redundancy. So if we didn't have inheritance, each one of these would be its own class. And let's say down the road, GURPS changes something in the equipment. If I didn't have an inheritance, I would have to go to every one of those classes in which GURPS changed, and I would have to change it, even though they were the same. Let's say GURPS changed the strength of a weapon. That would be very difficult. But with inheritance, what I can do is change it in one place. I get away from redundancy. So let me wrap things up. So in this video, we introduced inheritance. And fundamentally, inheritance is a way that we can build subclasses from parent classes, reducing redundancy and keeping things nice and clean. In the next video, in part 2, we're going to actually implement it for the course, and we'll see how it's done in the particular programming language that we're using. So with that being said, let's go and learn something.